Okay, welcome back everybody. So I think you should know me by now, but I was on the first panel, Shiro Armstrong from the Australian National University. It's my pleasure and honour really to chair this second panel, and we have really a treat here with three speakers, but we'll start with our first, the Honourable Nicola Grigg, Minister of State for Trade and the Minister for Women. So the plan is for the Minister to give some remarks, take some questions, and then we'll move to our other two speakers afterwards. So Minister Grigg, are you able to hear us? Great, we can see you. I'm sorry.
You can see me?
Yep, I'm sorry you can only see the backs of some people, but we've got about 100 more who are watching you closely. So please, over to you.
Oh, look, thank you so much, Professor. Thanks for the introduction and indeed this wonderful opportunity to join everyone today. It really is a privilege to give some opening remarks to you all. As has been announced, I am the Minister of State for Trade, the Associate Minister of Agriculture and the Minister for Women. And those three portfolios, across them, trade is inextricably linked across all of them. And more than that, you'll all be aware that it is one of the key tools our government is leaning into to grow New Zealand's economy. It has been a big year for New Zealand trade negotiators, and we do thank them and acknowledge them. In May, the EU FTA entered into force far sooner than was predicted, and that saved about $46 million immediately in tariffs for Kiwi exporters. In September, we have concluded the comprehensive economic partnership between New Zealand and the UAE, which is actually our first FTA with the Middle East, and that's really going to give Kiwi exporters a real commercial advantage in that growing market. As part of my Agri delegation, I'm the Minister responsible for horticulture. And this is really exciting because the deal delivers 98.5% tariff elimination to New Zealand exporters on day one, the day of entry into force. And last month, we closed the GCC deal after nearly 20 years of negotiations. And that's all because we significantly re-engaged with the region beginning in February this year. And that FTA includes provisions that will make doing business easier with preferential access for our primary sector exporters. It's going to streamline customs procedures and, of course, the big focus, reducing trade barriers. So in practice, that essentially means that we can access markets in a far more effective and efficient way while saving on those really burdensome costs and consequently providing a more profitable environment for our exporters, in particular our farmers and growers. And just a couple of weeks ago, we signed the ACCTS agreement with Costa Rica, Iceland and Switzerland. And that is all about sustainability, and it's going to provide some really great opportunities for our sheep farmers and our wood producers in particular. Trade is obviously essential to the success of New Zealand, and so it really excites me that groups like yourselves are gathering to discuss the rules of trade, which, especially in this current environment of increasing protectionism, and that's causing real pressure on the WTO. So while the government seeks to tap into as many markets as we can, it's pertinent for this year's ATEPS to be focusing on the Southeast Asian region, which is a region that our government has prioritised on engaging with. As many of you, I'm sure, will know, the Prime Minister, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Minister for Trade, and indeed the Minister of Defence have all visited the region this year. I myself had the privilege of accompanying the Prime Minister on a trade mission up to Malaysia and South Korea just a month or so ago. And more recently, I travelled into Laos to attend the ASEAN Economic Ministers meeting. And so that's where I got the opportunity to reinforce the government's intentions to strengthen our engagement with the Southeast Asian region. And it's really important, particularly to New Zealand's primary sector. Next year, New Zealand and ASEAN, which I'm sure you know stands for the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, it's going to reach a really important milestone. 2025 is the 50th anniversary of our dialogue relations, and that is quite significant. So our enduring ties with the region, which are actually founded in defence, and of course the impressive economic, it's massive growth potential, are one of the reasons why we're really intending to elevate our relationship with ASEAN to a comprehensive strategic partnership. Collectively, ASEAN is, if you called it a country, it's the world's fifth largest economy. It's New Zealand's fourth largest two-way trading partner. It's our second largest source of imports and the fourth largest export market for goods. And that's why we want to focus on the region, because of that enormous potential for growth that we see coming down the line. It's got a rapidly growing middle class and they're seeking high quality products. And Southeast Asia is going to remain going forward an important strategic and trade and relationship partner for us. And our relationship, particularly with ASEAN, is underpinned by really strong people-to-people links, and that's why the government's so focused on those people-people links, getting on planes, getting into markets, and our trade ministers are really focused on meeting our counterparts, both in this region and, of course, around the world. Looking at the big picture, you may have heard that the government's got a very lofty target of doubling our export revenue in the next decade. And so I see that as a huge opportunity to contribute to this target by fostering the relationships with these ASEAN markets. By establishing the great trade relationships, we can create so many opportunities for our farmers, for our growers, and for businesses across wider New Zealand Inc. And that's especially important when we need to grow the economy, which is the government's #1 priority. To get the best outcome, though, for New Zealanders, we have to not only capitalise on existing agreements, but we've really got to lean in and push hard and look for new and emerging agreements in nations around the world that we haven't already had relationships with. And that's particularly true in Southeast Asia, just in terms of upgrading existing agreements, where some people have described it as the noodle bowl of overlapping agreements with key partners. The existing agreements that our exporters can trade under include the MFAT, excuse all the acronyms, the RCEP and the CPTPP. These complement the bilateral agreements that we have with the likes of Singapore, Thailand, and Malaysia. And that creates a so-called menu of options for our exporters. And our government's really focused on maintaining and building those relationships and increasing the market penetration going forward. NTBs is a big one. And so I just want to talk a little bit about those because, of course, to boost the value of exports, we need to also focus on the barriers that aren't tariffs. So NTBs make it harder for New Zealand business to sell their products overseas. And that's exactly why we need to identify and rectify anything that we hear is affecting our exporters. In the year ended December 2023, New Zealand exported nearly $100 billion of goods and services to the rest of the world. That's in the context of being a $300 billion economy. So as of August, MFAT's tracking about 200 NTBs, which are affecting about $10 billion worth of trade. So I hope that gives you the contextual understanding of why it's so important to track these things down and begin to start to erase them as we go forward. But coming from a farming background, I'm acutely aware of the barriers that some of our exporters face in overseas markets, including in Southeast Asia, which I've been talking a lot about. And they include complex certification processes, import restrictions, and really opaque, unclear labelling requirements, which can result in our exporters leaving value on the table. And that's what we want to seek to resolve. And so that brings us to discuss the importance of rules. As I'm sure you will be touched on by other speakers later today, the rules-based system that's both multilaterally and in our regional agreements are incredibly important. And as I mentioned at the outset, we are now in a world characterised by increasing instability. And so for a country as small and geographically distant as ours, we're an island nation at the bottom of the Pacific, these rules are critical. And there will be some excellent presentations over the next 2 days that will offer plenty for you to think about, I'm sure. There will be many connections to be made and I hope ideas to take forward. So I hope you'll take away something valuable that will contribute to your future work in this incredibly important area. I hope that one day our paths may cross and indeed the government looks forward to the futuristic thinking of people like yourselves. And I just want to thank you for your time and attention and happy to take some questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Minister Grigg. Look, you touched on a number of points that we talked about in the first panel, and it's really reassuring to hear you highlight the rules, and not just bilateral regional rules, but multilateral rules that are going to be so important as protectionism is on the rise, as you discussed. So I understand we have time for a couple of questions. So let me open the floor, and those who'd like to, please put your hand up, and it'd be good if you could introduce yourself to the Minister as well. While you think, I have a question, and then you can perhaps join in. But Minister Grigg, you talked about the importance of opening other markets and tackling non-tariff barriers and non-tariff measures behind the border. And I think that's great for exporters. One thing that I think we'll talk about over the next 2 days will be the importance of imports as well. That's not usually such an easy thing for ministers, for politicians to talk about, but it is where a lot of gains come from, with cheaper goods. And of course, in New Zealand, you don't manufacture everything, you don't make everything. And New Zealand is, of course, very open, but what is the sort of reform or trade liberalisation priority right now in New Zealand? So that's a question, and I will take a couple more, so it gives you a bit more time to formulate policy on the fly if there isn't a response to that already.
It's interesting that you raised that question, because I actually just had a meeting this morning with a group of arable growers who grow seed and grains that are really critical to the agricultural industry, because in their view they underpin it. They grow the grass that feeds the cattle, which supports our meat and dairy industry. And they touched on this exact point that while it's wonderful that we go out and secure these trade arrangements, the quid pro quo is that they are starting to see much cheaper imports coming in that they frankly can't compete with. So, look, I don't have any policy to share with you on that. In fact, if Vangelis is in the room, he's definitely the man to talk about it. But what I would say from a government perspective is that we don't know what we don't know, and so it's really good that stakeholder groups like that can raise these issues with us. And look, I'm the minister responsible for horticulture, I'm getting the same feedback from the lime growers around New Zealand, because they can't compete with the import cost of the limes coming in from certain other jurisdictions. Equally, the strawberry growers would say the same thing. So, governments and trade negotiators have to make big, hard decisions, and there is always a little bit of give and a little bit of take. But, we have to put it in the context of what gets us the most gains for New Zealand Inc., and they are the trade-offs that have to be made at times.
Great. Hi, Minister. My name is Abby Miles. I'm from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade.
Hi, Abby.
I'd be really interested to hear more of your thinking about how you see the links between your portfolios as Minister for Women and also in your trade portfolio as well. Thank you.
Did you ask me this question the other day? Yes, I was at MFAT for morning tea the other day and got asked the same question. Really, it's great. There's some really exciting emerging women in business. And in fact, I've got an awards night tomorrow night to attend. But women in export are increasingly making their mark. You'll start to see new, quite innovative chapters starting to emerge in some trade arrangements where we look to population profiles, be it around Indigenous or be it around women. One of the big, and if I sort of helicopter out a little bit and look at the big picture, one of the big frustrations at the moment with encouraging women into business and indeed empowering them is around the lack of startup capital. And if you get any of the major women business leaders in this country, it's their biggest bugbear is the vast majority of seed funding goes into male startups, not into female startups, which I think is a societal thing that we've all got to talk about collectively. But if we can resolve that issue and find that capital that goes into more innovative female-led businesses that ultimately go on to export, I think we're going to see some really cool things starting to happen. And it was quite interesting. I had a meeting up in Brisbane on Friday, just been about a week ago, with my PACER Plus counterparts, and they're starting to ask questions around, what New Zealand is doing to encourage women into business and ultimately into exports. So it's quite good that the conversation is starting to happen and people are getting more engaged on it.
One question very quickly. Good morning, Minister. This is Jimena from the Consulate of Colombia in New Zealand. I see that you don't see me, but I'm here. I promise.
Welcome.
And I just have a question related to the agreement that you mentioned with Costa Rica. So if you please elaborate a little bit more on what is it about?
Sorry, I'm not entirely sure of your question.
Yes. And over your talk, you mentioned few agreements that were signed recently.
Oh, yes, sorry, the ACCTS.
Yes.
Yeah, look, it's not one that I am intimately across, but I just know that it is very much focused on creating new pathways around sustainability expectations, and it's very much going to provide opportunities for the primary industries in that sheep farmers and for particularly for wood producers. But again, Vangelis, can I throw to you if you're there?
We might bring Vangelis in after you've had to leave us, Minister, because we're going to put Vangelis in the line of a lot of questioning soon, I think.
Okay, just to explain a little bit, my trade delegation is very much around the Southeast Asian region and the Pacific region. So I'm focused on arrangements like ASEAN and RCEP and PACER. So the South American and European and Middle Eastern type arrangements are very much Todd McClay's remit.
Well, Minister, thank you very much for your time this morning. I understand we're out of time, but that region that you're responsible for pursuing trade arrangements with, ASEAN and the Pacific, of course, is so important for not just New Zealand's prosperity and well-being, but the broader region as well. And I remember when COVID first hit and everybody was restricting trade, borders closed everywhere, New Zealand did an arrangement with Singapore, a very basic back to basics arrangement just to provide security of supply of food. Now, I fear we might be in a world again soon where we have to go right back to basics and make the case for just open trade and why we shouldn't restrict exports of agriculture. I don't see that happening in New Zealand, but the temptation everywhere will be for closed markets and reciprocity. So we look forward to, again, New Zealand leadership as global markets face much more uncertainty. Please join me in thanking the Minister. Great, and we might invite our panellists to join us on the stage now. So we are joined by the Consul General for the United Kingdom, Durgahee, and of course, Chief Nudger for New Zealand, nudging the rest of the world into openness, Vangelis Vitalis. So Resh, over to you for initial remarks, then we'll go to Vangelis for some.
Yeah, thank you, Shiro. Tēnā koutou katoa, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for the very kind invitation to speak here this morning. It's really exciting. I am learning a lot already this morning, which is great. And it's an honour to be speaking alongside such eminent colleagues. And I'd like to particularly thank, of course, Minister Grigg for her remarks just now. So as Shiro mentioned, my name is Durgahee. I'm the fairly new British Consul General here in Auckland, 2 months in, so go easy, and also Trade Councillor for the UK and New Zealand. And I'm really glad to be here today. It's a great opportunity to speak a bit about the world of trade with this lens from a UK perspective. And so I'll aim to do that. I'll just move these. There we go. I'll aim to do that with a lens from the UK. So I mentioned I'm just over 2 months in here in Auckland, and one of the great things about this role as Consul General is, and indeed I think being a diplomat working on international trade, is the opportunity to get out and about at events such as this. And one of the privileges of this job is meeting with businesses to understand just how trade policy, which people are working on in the room here, goes beyond the headlines and impacts and makes a tangible difference on the ground, both to businesses, but also ultimately to their end customers, which are actually us as well. There's an endless array of kind of industry sectors, subsectors, and like I mentioned earlier, you're always learning on the job. Last week, I had meetings with a company that works on artificial intelligence video analytics. I'm still trying to process what that means. A helicopter manufacturer. And next week, we'll be speaking with fintech players and we'll be hosting an agri-tech delegation from the UK in New Zealand, which is fantastic. But getting to know the businesses and all of those different sectors is really interesting because you get to hear about the opportunities and the challenges that they're facing. That's essential to understand if we're to create a policy environment that is where they can thrive and where businesses can succeed. So I guess what I'm trying to say is the diversity of our jobs working on trade is really great. And I'm probably playing to a home turf audience here when I kind of say that as trade professionals, I think we've got a really good job, but some may disagree. Answers on a postcard afterwards. But look, in Auckland, my team's really focused on strengthening trade and investment, trade and business links between the United Kingdom and New Zealand. And we work closely with our High Commission down in Wellington, which is led by our High Commissioner, Iona Thomas. The UK and New Zealand, I think, people will be aware, of course, are united by shared histories, whakapapa and values, which are central to how we think about our place on the world stage. And we've heard a bit about our position on the world stage earlier this morning. My view is that it's really important that at times such as this, and we've heard again about the current geopolitical tensions that are here, that we work together very closely. And as we confront this array of complex challenges, we heard about Ukraine, the Middle East, the Indo-Pacific, and other areas. And so the answer becomes kind of clear when I start to think about it like that, and when we're starting to think about it in the British Consulate, that working together with like-minded champions of trade, plurilateralism, the rules-based international order, it's really important, and that's where I think our partnership is really strong. The UK and New Zealand partnership, we kind of think of as a stable, cooperative relationship, partnership based on shared values, and trade is at the heart of that. So between our two nations, we've of course got what we call the free trade agreement between the UK and New Zealand. It was fantastic to see recently the UK's new Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, meeting with Prime Minister Luxon, and they both talked at length about the importance of trade between our two nations and, crucially, the economic growth, of course, that results from that. And it was interesting to hear Minister Grigg's remarks about growth in New Zealand being centre to the administration here, and it's absolutely at the heart of what Sir Keir Starmer is trying to do in the UK. So I've touched a bit about kind of the broader aspects of that. In May, I mentioned that we celebrated the first year of the New Zealand-UK free trade agreement, which we think provides unparalleled access, opportunities to trade, work, grow and invest in the UK, and also vice versa for UK companies here in New Zealand. We think it's a vehicle, really, that shows what the relationship can be between the two countries. I think it's fair to say, and I take no credit for this, I'm new here, but the groundbreaking chapters in the FTA on Maori trade and economic cooperation, the environment, provisions promoting opportunities for SMEs, which are kind of the backbone of the economy in the UK, digital trade, professional services, they're all making a difference. And I think that the FTA sets the standard, really, for future trading agreements, certainly between the UK and other parties. But it combines, I think, what we recognise as New Zealand's innovation and innovative approach to trade policy with the UK's reach as a market of, 55, 60 million people. It removes tariffs, it simplifies procedures for business and improves mobility. But what I want to kind of see going forward is kind of making sure that companies are aware of it and that they're using it, and that they're using the kind of FTA preferences that are there and not paying unnecessary duties when actually there's something there that can help. And one of the things that my team are trying to do, and the Department for Business and Trade in the UK, is to promote the utilisation of that across different business sectors. But the FTA isn't the only thing. It's not the only part of our trading relationship in this part of the world. So we're really excited. On the 15th of December, so less than a month now, entry into force will take effect for the UK into our favourite acronym, CPTPP. We're delighted to become the CPTPP's first new member outside of the region to join this community of 12 economies spanning Asia, the Pacific, and now, thanks to the UK, Europe too. With the UK as a member, CPTPP now, economies make up 15% of global GDP and makes the bloc even more influential than it already is. To set global trading rules and norms. So we're really excited about the opportunity to be engaging in another fora with New Zealand and with other players around the region. So it's probably not escaped you that we've got a new government now in the UK. So we have had a change of government. We've got a new Prime Minister in Sir Keir Starmer. And I mentioned that he's really determined and our kind of mandate from him and his government is to place economic growth at the centre of everything that we do. And I think that's great because it kind of puts trade and investment at the heart of government policy. The Department for Business and Trade in the UK, which is kind of my parent department, is key to delivering that growth. And our new Secretary of State, not so new now, Jonathan Reynolds, has been clear that that's going to be the focus of our work. And it was really good and kind of quite heartening to see just before I arrived here that his first international engagement was with your very own Minister Maclay. So I think that kind of speaks a bit as well to the strong relationship that we've got. Growing our economy then, I think is going to be central, and I know it's central to New Zealand as well. So underpinning that is that open trading system and commitment to the rules-based order that we've already heard so much about from colleagues. And we think it's in the UK's interests to incentivise that and to work within the system. It's been challenged by increasingly multipolar kind of objectives, growing protectionism. Again, we heard about that this morning, and governments taking unilateral action on these issues. But the UK is clear that as an open trade-dependent economy like New Zealand, we want to commit to strengthening those multilateral fora and institutions and modernising them as we go. We've also prioritised our relationship, or resetting our relationship, I should say, with the European Union. That doesn't detract from our commitment to the Asia-Pacific region. I think you can have more than one commitment, he says naively maybe, but we're understanding that Asia-Pacific is one of the fastest growing parts of the world. And again, people more qualified than me have talked about the statistics around that. Our trading relationship with Asia-Pacific is really good. It's already worth over £121 billion, and we export over £60 billion into the region last year across different sectors. So again, a real opportunity, and we're committed to deepening and strengthening those ties. So over the last 4 months since the new Labour government came into power in the UK, many of our ministers have been in the region already, really quickly off the bat, which is exciting to see. So our new Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, has already been in the Asia-Pacific region, I think 4 times, to Indonesia, to Samoa, Korea, and he was in Laos for the ASEAN meeting, Foreign Ministers meeting. And our Minister for State for Trade Policy, Douglas Alexander, who's housed in the Department for Business and Trade, also attended the ASEAN Economic Ministers meeting in Laos. And whilst he was on that trip, went to Thailand to sign an enhanced trade partnership. So there's real momentum here, and I think we need to be kind of moving that along and making sure that that kind of continues with regards to our relationship here in the region. And closer to home, you might have seen over the kind of southern winter, we had our Foreign Office Minister, Catherine West, in New Zealand, which is another example, I think, a great example of where hopefully we can strengthen those ties. So I've talked a bit now, and I'll probably try and wrap up. I don't think we can simply acknowledge the importance of trade. I think we need to kind of actively embrace it and understand what it means for the people on the ground, us, our businesses that we're supporting through our policies. We've got an interconnected landscape, you could argue an interconnected seascape between the UK and New Zealand. We're on complete opposite parts of the globe, but we're very closely aligned, I think, in this space. And we're really keen that trade sits at the heart of our diplomacy between the UK and New Zealand, and that it's not just advantageous to us, it's imperative, because both our governments want to talk about growth for the populations of both of our countries. So I'll pause there. Norea tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you very much. And I'll pass on to the panellists.
Straight to me. Thank you very much. Before the microphone. So I wanted to make 4 sort of observations about rules and how important they are to us as a small state. And I think the first is just to state the obvious. It's about giving certainty. It's about transparency. It's about hopefully either levelling the playing field or giving us a preference into markets. And I can't remember if I said enforceable. I think that's a really a critical part of the concept of rules in a trade context. In terms of trade, of course, we've got the World Trade Organization and the set of rules that are there that we need to remember are the critical kind of safety net for all of us and continue, despite the challenges. The WTO does continue to provide the certainty, the transparency, and still the enforceability, and we can talk a little bit about how that operates through the multi-party interim arrangement as well. Importantly too, what people are trying to do now is also shore up the system by plurilaterals in the WTO, so the joint statement initiatives. And I think it is really important not to undersell and to remind ourselves that actually the WTO is successful. You know, more than 100 members are involved in the investment facilitation agreement. Investment facilitation for development agreement, the e-commerce plurilateral, domestic regulation plurilateral. I mean, these are significant numbers of the World Trade Organization membership that are advancing those. That is a very important set of rules that we're providing that sort of underpin the system. While it's a pity that not all members are there, it is important to remember that those rules do work. We just need to find a mechanism to make sure they apply, and we can talk about that in the Q&A, because I think we are going to need to grip that up in a way that perhaps hasn't been so comfortable for all of us. Look, my second observation is that for us, as we observe the challenges that are over, not just on the horizon, but in the immediate term, the rules matter even more. And what I think has become very interesting over the last 3 or 4 years is that the number of open plurilateral initiatives that New Zealand's been involved in are starting to gather more and more small and medium-sized states. And I would argue, if you look at the list of economies that are looking to shelter in these rules, Uruguay, Ecuador, Peru, Costa Rica, Switzerland, Iceland, Singapore, Ukraine, United Arab Emirates, really interesting that there's been a flood of applications or a willingness to commit to some of these rules-based initiatives. And then we've got the big guys are coming as well. Indonesia recently applied to join CPTPP. Korea has joined the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, another G20 economy. So you are seeing both the small and medium-sized states, us, but also the larger ones looking to rules as ways of ensuring their resilience. So if you look at the various open plurilaterals, the structures, the big ones are CPTPP, of course, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, the ACTS agreement that you heard about just before, that I'm happy to talk about if we've got space. I think we also need to be thinking quite actively about what we might do in the open plurilateral space around subsidies. And of course, as in New Zealand, I'd say agricultural subsidies, but I would argue that there's probably a deal to be made on industrials and agriculture. I think too, we need to think about how we plurilateralise work that we could do together on non-tariff barriers. So in other words, there are other things that we could do using the rules that shore it up, but accept that not everyone has to be in it. And New Zealand has a long tradition, along with Singapore, Chile and others, of trying to create these enabling frameworks that others then participate in when they're ready to join us. So those are my first 2 observations. My third observation really is, let's not forget how important the norm-building institutions are and the norm-building initiatives are, because over time, and this is really taking a strategic view of trade policy, over time those norm-building institutions deliver rules. So APEC, the OECD, the FAO, the work that gets done there is absolutely critical because it builds trust and confidence amongst groups of members, not necessarily all, but groups of members who then pick up those ideas and use them in their sort of international treaties, the trade agreements that get negotiated. APEC is the classic example. The work that's the customs procedures, the rules of origin, the SPS facilitation procedures that were negotiated in RCEP and in CPTPP, they have a direct line through to the work that was done in APEC throughout the 90s and the 2000s. So all of that agonising work that officials do in all of those working groups and committees and structures, over time gets picked up and is used because you've built the trust and confidence amongst colleagues that, yes, we do trust your system here and here. We're prepared to look at you in terms of your digital standards over here because of the guidelines that APEC worked on. So these are really important. We need to remember how important these structures are. And I think we need to remember, particularly at this moment when the rules are going to be under tremendous pressure, not to ignore the fact that these norm-building institutions are now more important than ever. I'd add to those norm-building institutions some of the initiatives that we've been involved in. The Global Trade and Gender Arrangement, the Indigenous Partnership for Economic Cooperation and Trade Arrangement, the Inclusive Trade Action Group, and the direct read across from work that was done in APEC in 2021 during New Zealand's host year on environmental goods and services, and the way that was picked up almost completely in the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability. So again, all of those things, you build trust and confidence with partners and gradually you expand those, and then what you expect and hope is that you bring them into your rules. My final very quick observation is just a message that there is we've all observed the US election result and we all know that there are various things likely to hit us, but we need to remember that as small states we still have agency here, and the way in which we have agency and the way in which we exercise that is by absolutely trying to create space for ourselves, the elbow room that we need, and that is through protecting and sustaining, and I do believe the WTO is really important, and I do think it continues to be successful, but in different ways than we have traditionally thought about it. But those open plurilateral initiatives that I talked about, those are a vital part of shoring up the system, of sustaining it, accepting that maybe not everyone wants to be bound by those same rules or those norms, but that we can work with groups of economies to do that. And I'm heartened by the fact that the number of economies that are showing interest in all of this is expanding all the time. I'm not at all surprised that it's fellow small states that are looking for shelter in these difficult times, but I'm particularly heartened that the big economies, as you've just said, are looking to be part of these initiatives as well, whether it's CPTPP for Indonesia, for the UK, Digital Economy Partnership for people like Korea, and so on. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Vangelis. Look, not anymore. Look, a rich set of issues have been raised. I think we've got 20 minutes and we can have plenty of questions. I want to have a first stab at a question or two, though, and to both speakers. These open plurilaterals providing some shelter. My concern, though, and this is what I want to press you both on, is we're going to have enough shelter for what's coming. And really, the United States has gone from enforcer of the multilateral system to spoiler, and is a source of uncertainty now. And we've talked about it all morning, but the huge tariffs that are underway and trying to make sure the rules are not enforceable in the multilateral system, that's a fair bit of uncertainty from the United States. How would the UK, New Zealand, but I want to press you a little bit more, New Zealand influencing the region, respond to 10% or even 20% tariffs from the United States? Do you do nothing? Do you retaliate? A lot of countries retaliate. Do you try to negotiate exemption like Australia did? And we seem to be very pleased with ourselves negotiating voluntary export restraint, which is just a quota arrangement, and not actually advisable, but that seems to be the political mood. Or are there any other options, like liberalising in the face of, that sounds counterintuitive, but you ask a trade economist, what's the answer to any question? It's to liberalise in the face of anything. And how might we do that collectively? So, Resh, maybe first to you on, the relationship with the United States, and it's difficult in normal times, but the shade that's about to come.
Thanks, Shiro, for that question. So I guess the first thing to say is the UK and the US have a very strong relationship and have done for many years. The Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, very quickly was on the phone to President-elect Trump to congratulate him on his victory in the election, and both agreed that the UK-US relationship needs to continue and should continue in a strong and positive way. It's a relationship that's underpinned by many things, shared values around democracy, around business and enterprise, around security and military, entrepreneurship, all sorts of things. And I think the position that we're taking is that that will continue, and we will work with any administration that we need to work with. So we look forward to that. I think it would be probably not great for me to comment too much on particular policy that might come up, because you're right, there will have to be policy conversations about kind of reactions to what may come. I will leave that to London and Washington, and I'll stay here in Auckland. But yeah, you're right. It will be important. But I think underpinning everything is that relationship needs to be strong. And if this is one area that will need policy to develop, it will have to happen, but we'll see what happens. I can't really say much more.
Yeah, no, understood. Thanks, Resh. Now, same question for you, Vangelis, but in addition, because we do know that, of course, New Zealand has been very proactive and really strategic in these arrangements, open plurilaterals, and playing a leadership role. And you do have agency, we have agency, but New Zealand particularly, if you look at relative to your size, because of the leadership role you've played, how do you, not just New Zealand's response, but how do you try to get the Chinese from not retaliating towards the Americans? How do you try to avoid disintegration where everyone starts to retaliate and the Southeast Asians are trying to stop more Chinese goods flooding in? What do you think your role is going to be in the next 6 months or so?
So yeah, great, great question. Look, the observation I would make is, first of all, on the question of retaliation, I don't think that's a game that New Zealand would want to get into. And for a start, imposing tariffs imposes costs on your own consumers. So that seems to me like a real own goal for a small state like ours. So I think the interesting question is going to be that primary impact, which will be US imposing whether it's a universal tariff on everyone, if it's 10% or 20%, okay. That will mean that all of us will be less competitive in the domestic US market against US competitors. The challenge, I think, becomes very much if particular exemptions are then provided. So I think the secondary question really is who gets an exemption, whether there will be any exemptions, and then how others react. So you asked me, what would we say to China or indeed the EU or the other major trading blocs, Mercosur and others? We would, of course, be saying, please, restraint within the rules. That is a really important element for us. And the point we'd be making to them, as we would in Washington, is these rules are vital to us as a small state. We really value them, and we think you should too. You may draw different conclusions, but we continue to believe this system is the way in which we protect ourselves, including from coercive acts and unfair practices from others. So I don't think you could expect our message in that sense to change. We're not naive, though, that in Beijing, Brussels, or indeed Washington, we are going to be coming up with a brilliant argument that no one there had thought of, and therefore they're not going to do anything. I think instead we are going to be very active in the space of looking to develop initiatives, working together, as we do already in these open plurilateral spaces, demonstrating that the rules matter, and above all, I think for a small state, it's making sure that we really do have agency, that we are shaping those rules. So if you look at the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, that was an attempt by 3 small states to say, look, there's a gap out there. either we wait for the rules to be written by the big guys and then imposed on us, or we try to shape those rules in a way that works for us and for our small and medium enterprises and for our tech firms, and we then set those rules and then hope that others will join us. And look, the long queue of applicants, Korea G20 economy moving into it, I think has demonstrated for us as small states that we can actually influence and shape the rules. We do have agency, and I think that is at the core of what we're going to try to do as we deal with the turbulence ahead.
I think just to add to that, role for Auckland University here, for the academic and sort of think tank community, is to provide the evidence for policymakers and for decision makers. So, doing some modelling, how costly is it if you retaliate? Now, how much more beneficial is it if you actually hold the line and don't raise tariffs in response, or liberalise in the face of rising protectionism and act collectively? So that's the kind of modelling that I think in Trump 1.0 helped mobilise some action in Southeast Asia, for example. These disaster scenarios. If you model the effects of free trade agreements, you get small positive numbers. If you model the effect of the whole system breaking down, you get big negative numbers. That motivates a lot of action. Look, one more quick question before I open it up. So please have your questions ready, and I'll start to look for hands. But everybody spoke of CPTPP, the most awkward acronym that, of course, the Minister had trouble pronouncing. I don't blame him. I can't remember what it is. But the UK is now a member, and will formally be a member very shortly. The big question for CPTPP, an expansion of rules, is to wrap the Chinese in the rules. It's put its hand up to join the rules written by this group of countries in the Asia Pacific. That is a red button for the security communities in many countries. In Canberra, we've lost a lot of trust in the relationship with China. Tokyo is going to be difficult. But the UK now also has a veto on new membership. Everyone has to agree. Is it something that's possible? Do we want the Chinese in the agreement? What is the likely pathway, do you think? So maybe that's to both of you.
Yeah, shall I kick off? So I suppose the first thing to mention around this is that the UK is kind of working alongside the Auckland Principles around the rules around trade, so open to accession for economies as long as they meet the high standards that are set, as long as there's a demonstrable kind of compliance with existing arrangements, whatever those may be. In terms of China and the UK's relationship, I think the UK's kind of aware, obviously, and understanding that we trade and invest with China. They're a major global player, and they've got a growing role in many industries. I think the approach that we take is probably around, I think they're called kind of collaborate where we can, compete where we must, but also challenge where we think there's something to be challenged in a constructive and positive way, and to address those if those happen. And I think that's the approach that the UK would take with regards to China. There are lots of issues around overcapacity and the effects that will have on the global economy from a Chinese perspective. So I would rest on that kind of UK stance. I think that we recognise that China is a global player. As with New Zealand, the UK trades with China, and we need to be cognizant of the fact that that's not going away anywhere. So I would rest on those kind of 3 C's. It's kind of collaborate, compete, but also challenge where it's needed.
Thanks, Rish. Vangelis?
Thank you. Yeah, I knew I should have gone first. The Auckland principles are the ones that I think are critical here. That, as you said, consensus, can you meet the high standards, and your track record of compliance. So those are really important products from New Zealand's host year, and along with the accession of the UK, that formal signature piece. Those were signal elements of what we did that year. I think it's also really important to remember that the Auckland Principles are very clear that is the filter. It is not a mechanical linear process that we take each economy in the order that they've applied. It is, can you meet those 3 principles, or where do you stand on those principles, and do we all agree? And then we take that forward. So it is not a linear just because you're the latest to submit, which means that someone else could submit tomorrow that may well be able to meet all those standards more quickly and then comes to the front of the group. I think the other really important thing to remember, we have big work to do this year in Canada, which is hosting this year. It's not only grappling with the question of accession, but it's also making sure that we review and upgrade the agreement. So that's going to be a big piece of work to keep that sort of gold/platinum standard that we pride ourselves on, reminding ourselves that some of the chapters are actually more than a decade old, because some of them were concluded well in advance of the signature of the agreement. So actually we have some work to do if you think about some of those chapters. Some of the chapters are in the good category, but certainly could do better. There's areas, for example, there's no reference to climate change, for example, in CPTPP. We would certainly expect the sort of Indigenous economy exporter piece to be in there. Certainly the digital rules in CPTPP need, from our perspective, updating, including in the context of some of our domestic elements that are going through here.
Great. Now let's...
Did I dodge that nicely?
Questions from the audience. I have many comments, of course, but I'll restrain myself. Who would like to ask the first? Yes.
Oh, I'll judge. Yeah.
That's all right.
Quick question. With the tariff increase as an outcome from the Trump administration election, there is a potential risk of increase of Chinese cheap goods reverting from America. In Tonga, there's already an increase of Chinese cheap goods, and with the context in New Zealand, what policy or rules is in place to assist New Zealand where this comes about in the when it comes into place with the Trump administration? What do you guys have in place to limit and avoid the flooding of those products? Because I can see that also in the Pacific, especially for Tonga. Thank you.
Just hold for a second. We'll collect a couple more questions. One down here and one over here. Sorry.
This one first? No?
Okay, we've got that
Just
one first and then
so
these
for
two.
my steps.
We'll get the 4 questions and we'll have our 2 panelists answer.
Matthew Parry, Ministry for Primary Industries. With the US expected to ignore or maybe even leave the WTO, is there paradoxically an opportunity for the rest of the membership to get together and do institutional reform?
Someone go down here, there we go. US exiting the WTO. We'll go to the WTO for the It also wants to downgrade to the gap, I understand, Trump is threatening.
Thank you. So, I mean, I think it's very interesting you're talking about all these different set of rules, whether multilateral, plurilateral. There is always this kind of spaghetti ball kind of issue. It has always been there. But then I'm putting myself in the shoes of the end users, so the companies. And when you're negotiating and adopting these new rules, how do you relate to their needs? How do you integrate provisions that can also support them? But beyond that, how do you relate to small business associations? And I'm thinking about women entrepreneurs in particular that could benefit from these rules. But there is a huge knowledge gap about that as well from these entrepreneurs. So how do you integrate that perspective into your negotiations, and how do you see that impacting those businesses and their access to international trade?
Thank you, Diane, from the delegation of the European Union. I have a question that is very much in the same space as that of Matthew. We've heard a lot about the value of the multilateral trading system. Obviously, the EU is very much in that space as well. The pressure that system is under, that speaks very much to the need for maybe enhanced coordination or cooperation amongst those who very much believe in the commitment to the system. Irrespective of size, from small islands to big blocks, I would say. But what does it mean in practice? Does it mean that we basically need to reinvent multilateralism? Does it mean that we need to reinvent plurilateralism?
So that is the tough 4 questions in only a few minutes, and we'll give you both a chance to respond to any or all of those questions as the final wrap-up. So who'd like to go first? Rish, maybe?
Shall I take this one? Yeah. Thank you for those questions. If I may take the third one around, which came from down the front, around how are we relating the needs of end users and integrating kind of the solutions that they need into our trade negotiations and trade policy activity. Really good question. My background is on trade promotion as opposed to trade policy, and that's one of the key questions. Really, I mentioned about kind of getting on the ground and speaking with businesses. From a UK perspective, throughout the negotiations or the run-up, we're kind of doing lots of consultations with businesses on the ground to understand, opening up to comments or questions about what they would like to see and what would be useful. In terms of kind of at the moment, let's say with the UK and New Zealand, it's about implementation. It's about utilisation of the agreement that's been put in place. A couple of examples, what we're doing in the UK. So earlier this year, we did a fantastic roadshow across the UK, speaking with SMEs right across the UK in all 4 nations, in all different sectors, to promote the opportunities in New Zealand and to promote the FTA. Because I think there is, as with all of these kinds of things, there's often a gap in knowledge and understanding of kind of what does it mean for me as a business and what am I going to get out of it? And actually, you could be saving some money and that will save your end customers. And we'll be doing the same thing. We're going to be doing an Indo-Pacific roadshow across the UK where we'll hopefully work, I'm sure we will work with New Zealand House in London. And it's about getting the message out there, I think, on the ground with SMEs and with companies, and not relying on kind of, just because we're in this space, it doesn't mean everyone else is talking this language. So I would say it's really important, and it's important to get boots on the ground and trade policy colleagues to work hand in glove with our trade promotion colleagues who are going out there and getting all of that intelligence.
I'll try and answer as many as I can. So just on the first question on overcapacity, I think that is a serious challenge. So one of the unintended or perhaps intended consequences of these tariffs that the US may or may not impose will of course be not just a universal tariff on everyone, but also this much higher tariff against China. And so therefore what happens to that those Chinese exports? Where do they go? I think there's 2 elements. So the New Zealand response will be very much within the rules. We have an anti-dumping regime, trade remedy system. So if we believe that that activity is happening, as we do with anyone else, we would be conducting an investigation and then thinking about what we would need to do in response. I think the other, perhaps much more serious challenge is not what New Zealand does, but how others react. And so my big anxiety then is that in reaction to the overcapacity problem that spreads, and we've already seen evidence of that from the Canadians, who have acted in a particular way that is clearly a breach of the rules, or the European Union, which has acted completely within the rules. So our hope is that when people react to this, they will continue to use the existing rules-based instruments to manage that challenge. But it is going to be one of the really significant risks for all of us, I think, out there, that overcapacity problem. But I think in many ways, despite the bilateral impact, it's also how everyone reacts to that and what responses they provide that's going to tell us something very important about the future of our rules-based system. The second point on yours on WTO withdrawal, make a couple of observations, sort of a New Zealand one, which would be huge anxiety about what that would mean for US commitments to New Zealand or to the membership. For example, MFN quotas on beef, which are extremely important for New Zealand. A number of dairy quotas that the United States has provided to the WTO membership, including some just to New Zealand. What happens to those if they withdraw? So there's a direct impact. However, as you say, is there an opportunity in there? And of course, I'd kind of make an observation which would be that, yes, the prospects for reform might be more positive, but I would observe that there are other actors in the WTO that, how can I put it, have not been particularly constructive in a whole range of areas. They are other major players, and they have not been. I'm not going to comment on who they might exactly are, but it is a matter of public record of where we got to in Abu Dhabi, for example. So I do think there is an opportunity. I think there is a big question for us. What do we do about the joint statement initiatives? And are we going to press on, insisting they must be part of the Annex 4 key in the WTO? Given that there is a very significant handful of obstacles to that, other members, do we actually need to say something about that and say, look, clearly some members are not ready for that to be an Annex 4 agreement, therefore we will do it as an open plurilateral outside. But as soon as we're able to, we want to bring that back into the organisation for the obvious reasons. Implementation, I thought you've covered that. I mean, there's two elements. There's implementation and then the information we get from business while we're negotiating. So how do you design an effective certificate of origin, for example, that minimises transaction costs for New Zealand businesses? That's a big focus of our work as well. You know, what kind of e-certification system would work? I mean, New Zealand is quite a long way to go still on paperless trade, right, Abby? But you're working on it. So, but we have areas where we do need to work. I mean, I would make an observation too about what we can do unilaterally. Paperless trade is clearly one where we really do need to lift our game. And I would say also infrastructure, ports, roads. In New Zealand, if we are serious about the doubling exports, our ports cannot handle it. So they are not fit for purpose, and we do need to really grip that up. What was the last one? Reinvent multilateralism. That's a tough one because large part of my career has hinged on and depended on US leadership to get things done in agriculture or finishing the WTO agreement on agriculture. Those have been really important. So this adjustment that we're all having to make, where the United States is not yet an obstacle, but it's certainly not an enabler. And it's clear that the other major players, including the EU, while they may be supportive of the system, have not yet had the ability to drive the kind of changes that we need. So I do think we're going to have to ask ourselves some really difficult questions about what we think the system needs to look like, how it needs to be composed, and what sort of rules are going to be needed for all of us as we look out into that future.
Well, that brings us to the conclusion of the session on rules of trade. And I just have to say, it's not everywhere in the world where we get officials like Resh and Vangelis so articulately standing up for the rules. And it's so important. You were worried. It is so important, not just for the small middle powers, but in fact, if the large countries, the great powers, can recognise it too, it's in their interest. So there's a pretty big agenda for us going forward. We'll continue the discussion in the afternoon, but for now, please join me in thanking Resh and Vangelis.